Back at it again this morning. Went ahead and adjusted all the valves. They were 11 to 12, a loose 12, so I set them all back to a medium 10. The valve cover that was on the engine was a little bit dirty on the inside, and I knew this one from the race engine was good, and also the old fill cap was broke. So I just took the whole valve cover assembly and cleaned it up and put it on here with a new gasket. Also went through and poured some oil down the basically tube that goes into the oil pump before I put on the adapter for the oil filter and also where the lines hook up. So I put a new filter on it, filled it with oil. As you can see, I also attached our oil pressure sending unit. So we're ready to go. Just working on a few other things. This is the race engine. I was removing the thermostat housing because that has our water temperature sensor in it. So I wanted to be able to put that on the new engine once I get a new gasket, which should be here about 12:30. And I just happened to catch with my eye something didn't look right. And we were at the racetrack at Carolina Motorsports Fall this weekend, this couple weekends ago. The E30 guy said, hey, don't over rev the engines, be careful with them. They're known to have rocker arm failures. Well, this has the number 3 rocker arm failure, which explains the oil. So it looks like, and I don't have my flashlight with me, you can kind of see the rocker arms jammed down in there, and it broke enough to keep the valve open. So pretty sure that the valve got touched, but we won't know until we take it apart. So when we get back from the racetrack this weekend, next week I will pull the head off and see if it's salvageable or if I have to put a piston in it, or hopefully I can just put a new rocker arm and have all the valves checked. But we will let you know more in later. We're all ready to go back together. Just waiting on the gaskets to come in, which should be here in about 2 hours. So the exhaust manifold flanges are all degasketed and cleaned. Got the crank position sensor done. Water pump pulley's done. Rotor buttons on. Intake surfaces and throttle, or the thermostat housing surface is done. Just waiting on the O-rings for the drain back tube, and it should be ready to go back in. This is the intake off from the race engine. We know everything works, so I don't want to go through and change anything because the injectors are fine, the throttle body's fine, everything works good. So I went ahead and cleaned up the intake surfaces. And I also found when I was taking the feed line off for the fuel that it was not in the best of shape. So I cut it purposely to remind myself that, hey, it's time to replace that, and I always carry extra of that. So this is all ready. Even got the surface cleaned up for the new O-ring for the oil return. So now we will wait for the gaskets to come. Great day. So it's after lunch. All my gaskets came in. So we have the gasket for the thermostat housing to the head, and the 2 gaskets for the oil return tube that goes from the intake, which comes from the head down to the crankcase. So we'll get everything cleaned up, check it again, and put them in. Well, that was a workout. So what I finally figured out, probably after 2 or 3 takes, was I used a 10mm wrench and I put the tube and the spring and the O-rings and everything in the block, and then used the wrench to keep it compressed. And then I slid the intake manifold on, got it lined up good, and then pulled the wrench out, pulled the tube down, pulled the wrench out, and was able to seat it in there. And then I noticed there's a little bit of misalignment, so I went ahead and snugged the bolts up so that it was in a position it was going to be in. I went back, checked the O-rings, and made sure that they were seated good, both in the intake manifold and in the block. So I think that's it. The torque on those is 22 to 24, and I just did them in a bunch of different times, slowly torquing it up to the head because it's a soft gasket, and I didn't want it to pull up unevenly and cause a leak in the future. So that's done. Let's start hooking everything else up. Well, I think I got everything that I could put on there for now. I'm going to leave the spark plugs and exhaust manifold off, because what I usually do is I'll put it in, fill it with oil, get starter and everything hooked up, get the wiring system hooked up, fill it with oil, and then I'll run it without the spark plugs. And I've done that on all of my LS motors, and I've never had a problem, just to kind of get the oil all the way up through the top end, make sure it's getting to the bearings, and the most important thing is make sure I see oil pressure on my oil pressure gauge before I go any farther with it. Because I believe once you put the plugs in there, you're going to get that compression. So 135, 180 psi, whatever it is, then you can start dragging on the bearings. So I always do that. So we'll start getting it ready to put the transmission on. So we got the dust shield on. I cleaned the surfaces on the flywheel, bolted it up, torqued it to 77 foot-pounds. So I went to 40 first and then 70 the second time. Put the clutch alignment tool in and put the clutch on, put the pressure plate on, and then went about one turn, just to kind of draw the clutch fingers down fairly evenly till it seated up against the flywheel, and then torqued it to 25 foot-pounds, 24, 25 foot-pounds, somewhere in there. So let's get the transmission and bolt it up. So I think that's about done for everything I can do outside. So the transmission's hooked up and torqued, the starter's hooked up and torqued. That's a lot easier to do outside the car than inside. So I will check everything out and get it ready to put in the car. Unfortunately, my battery's dead, so I better charge it. So it's the next morning. I was able to get the engine and transmission bolted in after the battery died on the camera, and I went ahead and hooked up the shifter. So now all I got to do is hook up the clutch and the drive shaft and a few things in the back, and that'll be connected. Then I'll come up here to the engine compartment and finish all this. So we'll show you that as we go. So just a little status update, because it takes a while. I mean, everybody's put exhaust manifolds on, but the exhaust manifold's on, O2 sensor is hooked up, and I have the exhaust pipe and cherry bomb. Those are all fitted in place. There's a little modification I need to make to that, so I'll do that at lunchtime. So that's all installed. Got the new O-rings on the oil cooler lines, and those snugged up. So now the oil system is finished, so I can put oil in it. So that's what we're doing now. Yeah, 20W50 doesn't move real well when it's 40-45 degrees, so it's taking a while to fill it. But we'll get 4.5 quarts in there and have her prepared to fire off this afternoon, hopefully. So it's lunchtime. I'm going to go get me some lunch and I'm going to go to breaking point. So I have the last of the oil going in. Of course, the exhaust manifold's done. We have all the belts on, the power steering pump is on and tight, the alternator's on and tight, all the water lines, and the fuel line. So I rerouted the fuel line. I'm going to try that. I'm just worried about it sitting underneath the intake, and of course the clips get lost and broken, and that way we can see everything that's going on. So we're going to try that this race. So what I wanted to get to by lunchtime was a point where everything is done. Now I can hook up the electrical system. So I can pull the wiring harness over and start hooking things up. So I just finished with my initial testing. I got all the electrical hooked up, which I'll show you in a minute. Left spark plugs out, and unfortunately I plugged the fuel injectors in, so I would recommend, if you're doing this, leave the fuel injectors out or unplugged, because you get a little bit of fuel smell. And with me rehooking the fuel system up, I thought maybe that was it, but fuel system's all tight, and I'll keep checking that. So everything's hooked together. I don't have the throttle hooked up yet, or the cooling system. Just wanted to make sure everything worked. And it took about 45 seconds for the oil pressure to come up, but I got over 25 psi on the gauge, so all that works. So we will put some water in it, check that, make sure it doesn't leak, and put some spark plugs in it. See what happens. Well, everything is hooked up. Got water in it. Didn't have any water leaks. And I know a lot of people say, oh, this is the first start. So no, I actually started it for 5 seconds just to make sure. Fired right up. So I am going to check for leaks, let it run a little bit, put some more water in it. You know, just do the normal things. I've got to hook up the throttle cable and tie up all the wires, because I wanted to make sure all that was good first. And of course I unplugged pulled the pin on the onboard fire extinguisher, and I also have a fire extinguisher right by the door, so if anything goes bad, I am prepared, because we don't need to lose this, and I really like my shop. Well, there you have it. It runs. Sounds pretty good. Actually, the valve train sounds quieter than the original race engine, so I will continue buttoning things up. As you can see above the intake, there's a little spout sticking out, so I got to hook the fire extinguisher or the onboard fire suppression system back on for the engine compartment, and there's a lot of little wires to bundle up and stuff. So we'll just keep running it, open the garage door, and let off. Well, had another good successful test. I ran it up to about 140 degrees, checked for coolant leaks, checked for oil leaks, refilled the water tank, so it's about 2 gallons. I think I could put a touch more in it, but we'll do that when we get to the racetrack, so I know it's got enough water in it. Then I moved it to a clean part of the shop where I'm going to let it set just to see if there's any leaks. But I got everything tied up, got throttle cable all set up, all the wiring that we put in is all reattached and zip tied, so far it's ready to go. Only way to really test it is this Friday. We're doing a track day before the Lemons event at Atlanta, so that'll kind of shake everything out and make sure everything's good, but besides that, we're ready to go.